Hello, everyone, and welcome back to All Indie. Today, we've got some more dev talk. Oh, I probably should have asked you this ahead of time. Do you go by
Yeah.
Slosumo?
You can call me Slosumo or Andrash. I think Andrash is a bit harder to pronounce, but you can try if you want to.
One more time. What
Otherwise,
was
people call me Sumo in real life as well, so it's not a problem.
Sumo? Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm here today with Sumo. He is the dev on Simpocalypse, the game you're seeing right now. How you doing today?
Hey man, doing good. Yourself? Been a
Um,
long day, but all doing good.
well, I appreciate your time. Uh,
Yeah, no problem.
tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm one of the developers of the game Simpocalypse. I'm actually a part of a small team here in Slovenia. We're a team of three. I'm actually the lead programmer slash game designer, and then we have another programmer and another designer slash marketer. I'm actually a programmer by trade. I started working like on some web projects, then helped leading some design. I helped design some bigger projects. Like I worked for some casinos, helped design some games for them, and stuff like that. And then a few years ago, we got the chance to get into developing games, and here we are. We're now trying to do this full time, and Simpocalypse is basically our like first big standalone game.
That's awesome. You said you did
So yeah.
games for
Mhm.
casinos.
Yeah, we did some. Yeah,
Oh man, okay.
we collaborated with some company that has various websites, and they had some casinos, and I helped design some of the games. And at the time, we also made some of them. And the games were made in web technology, so like HTML, JS. So that's also what we're working from with the games.
Oh, that's awesome. I have a friend
Yeah,
who
yeah,
was doing casino games, and he made a slot machine before
uh,
moving to a different
yeah.
company. So I was like, "What? There's no way."
Yeah, yeah. There's actually quite a lot of casino companies, I think, in Slovenia as well, but it's actually pretty random. We had the opportunity through the company I worked for, and I still and help them develop some stuff. So we took the opportunity and did some projects. It's pretty fun working on those games, but it's even more fun to work on more actual games.
Right. Something. Yeah. Uh.
Yeah,
So what?
different.
Yeah, something different. So how did you get into gaming or game development, and like,
Yeah.
what are some of your favorite games?
Well, I have quite a few from the past, but recently, the funny thing is when you become a game developer, you actually don't even play any more games. So, but before this, I used to play and like games like, I don't know if you know, but System Shock 2, Half-Life, Age of Empires,
Ooh,
Red
yeah.
Alert. And yeah, then recently, a few years ago, I got into clickers and idle games, and that's actually where we also got the inspiration for working some the games we're working on now because we're kind of in the same genre. So yeah, that's basically how.
Sure. Okay. So, what kind of idle games and some of the clicker games
Mhm.
did you guys draw inspiration from to,
Yeah.
kind of help you in your
hmm
development and maybe in your idea
hmm
process for Simpocalypse?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so basically, the first ones we played were like Adventure Capitalist, Cookie Clicker, and I think Clicker Cookies. Those were like pretty much anyone in the genre played those. And we really like the concept of, for one, just like the incremental stuff, numbers getting bigger and bigger. And also, these games typically have like a prestige mechanic, or some people know it as New Game Plus. And this is basically where later in the game you sort of reset your progress and go and start the game from scratch, but with some huge bonuses that help you. pass some obstacles and some walls later in the game, and the growth is exponential and the numbers keep getting bigger. I mean, the first time usually when people get to play these games, they're like, what the hell is this? Like, it's just some numbers going up. But then usually then a day or two after, they, oh damn, I'm still playing.
Right.
So I think that
Yeah.
core loop is really interesting about these games, and the genre in general is getting more popular lately. So that's cool. And
Yeah.
one of the sorry, I just want to say, like one of the things I think is really cool about these games is that they can basically try to go after game topics or do things or mechanics that usual games don't, because they're in a way not that complicated, like graphically or visually, and that gives the developers kind of more time to invest in mechanics and the depth of the game. So I think that's one of the things that's so addicting about idlers and incrementals in general.
Sure. Okay. I never would have thought of it that way. Can you
Yeah, have
give
you?
me an example of like one of the features you guys have
Mm-hmm.
kind of worked on maybe more than the others because you weren't so worried about, yeah, like you
Okay.
said, like graphics or anything like that?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the typical gameplay loop or mechanic that most games up to a few years ago were constantly doing was like the prestige mechanic. That's basically you get up to a certain amount of currency, and then you prestige and you start with a huge bonus, and then you can go past that point and prestige again and prestige again and prestige again, and the numbers go crazy. But thing is that that was new for a few games, but then people just started copying and pasting all those things and not adding anything new. And so when we started our first game, War Clicks, we still wanted to keep that the that core mechanic in, but also experiment with some other things. And one of the things we did was that typically the games just use the prestige currency as a sort of multiplier on your general gain of resources. But in our case, we also actually our prestige was like you were building up army units like different tanks, vehicles, planes, submarines. And then when you prestige, you actually were able to use those units in a different type of a mechanic. We had it split in something like called a boot camp and a war zone. And in the boot camp, you produce the units and use this prestige mechanic to build up numbers. And then in Warzone, you fought enemies, and the units you built from the previous prestiges helped you get stronger and beat stronger enemies, sort of like Clicker Heroes does. But so we kind of connected the two mechanics. Yeah, that was one of the bigger changes or novelties at that times to such games.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
so are you familiar with any games, incrementals or idlers?
I am a little bit. I mean, I know
Yeah.
of like Cookie Clicker. And
Yeah, I
I
think everyone knows that one.
right. I'm trying to I feel like
Hmm.
this game for me was really was a little bit nostalgic because it kind of
Yeah,
reminded me of some of the like the old school like idle
yeah,
Java base builder games. I don't, and I'm still not
uh,
sure if that's completely accurate, but that's just for me kind of what I thought when I started
yeah.
playing.
Hmm.
I mean, did you guys take any inspiration from any games like that? Like some of the really old, like, yeah, the browser games or anything like that?
Yeah, I think at the time we were mainly basing things off like I think probably AdCap inspired our core bootcamp loop, and the main inspiration. Oops, sorry. And the main inspiration for our Warzone, it's kind of the game is kind of divided in two worlds, and
Yeah.
the Warzone parts was inspired by Clicker Heroes, and from there I think it was just like, okay, how can we make some interesting new mechanics that will connect both worlds well together, And one of the things we also wanted to do, which is actually a big, in a way, a big mistake we did, was we tried to implement multiplayer mechanics into that. So basically, people were fighting together and growing their scores together for their countries, competing in some leaderboards, and even had some like daily missions together, which was awesome for them. But it introduced a ton of complexity to development, server upkeep, cheating prevention, things like that. So I mean, it
Sure.
was awesome in terms of gameplay, but kind of for our first game, it caused us a lot of problems.
Is that something you guys are thinking about doing for the future? Maybe bringing a multiplayer type of game mode back?
Actually, for the time being, we want to focus on single player primarily because with Worklix we've found out how much work actually making such games for multiplayers can take, because the problem with multiplayer, particularly in idle games, is that you have to repeat the full logic from front end to back end, make sure people aren't cheating, which I kind of think in some cases can be even tougher to do than, like, for example, in RTS or um, in some more typical multiplayer games, just because you have to take account of idle time, which is basically when people are off the computer and they come back. And if the game has complex mechanics, you basically have to replicate that whole game loop for, I don't know, for 24 hours, 20 days, 100 days if someone was away. And that causes a lot of like performance issues and spaces for people to cheat, and that stuff gets complicated quite quickly. So yeah, for the time being, we're primarily focusing on single player, and that's because we can use the time we'd otherwise use on ensuring multiplayer works and is secure. We can instead use that time to basically make a better game, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like you have to trade that in, like, do we go multiplayer or do we simply make like a game that's a lot better, has more depth, is more polished. So because we want to primarily give the best experience possible, and like with Worklix, we still, after 3 years, like, we did a ton of updates and stuff, but there's still some bugs or issues the game has, because if we wanted to fix them, we'd actually have to rework the whole architecture and things like that. So yeah, that's why we're kind of opting towards the single player route for now, but you never know, in the future we might go back to some multiplayer games.
Okay. So you've kind of touched on it a little bit on some of
Hmm.
the different um aspects
Hmm.
and the different worlds of this game, right? Like, so you're the combat and the
Yeah.
um I'm trying to think of the map, I guess, with the different
Hmm.
colonies around it.
Yeah,
Something,
you. Hmm.
yeah, something
No,
I
sorry,
didn't.
sorry, go ahead.
You're fine. Something that I didn't quite get to was the
Hmm.
world map and the world market. That's something that I was
Hmm.
actually trying to record this morning to show
Hmm.
people who are interested. Um, but for those who won't see it in this video, would you mind kind of talking about it briefly and some of the
Yeah.
mechanics behind it?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to do with Simpocalypse, we kind of had a few goals. Like, we wanted to make like a really deep incremental game that kind of has a end goal, but can also be replayed a lot of times and give you different decisions, different ways you play. And one of the core things we wanted to add to the game kind of was to give the player the option to either like conquer the world more through a military way, more for an economic, or more for a diplomatic sort of way. And how we put that into the game was that um, you have in the game, you have like one of the mid game to late game things are, you're basically conquering territories, and the military mechanics is tank battles. You're basically tanks fighting tanks, and then you can do this also economically by buying or bribing the territories. And the diplomatic option we actually didn't get to yet because the game got so deep and we didn't manage to implement that yet. But that's sort of the two different ways we wanted to, two different options we wanted to give to the players. So because some players prefer more combat-based style, some just prefer like more a typical like tycoon or basically buying stuff with gold and optimizing your economy. And for the economy, we have a global world market, which is basically where you can buy and sell all of the game's resources. Like the game has resources like food, wood, water, energy, stone, iron, and on this market, the prices will change. Um, so you can kind of buy low, sell high, or it can help you balance out your economy. Um, and one of the things we wanted to implement in the market was like a dynamic supply demand system. So it's not because sometimes there are games that have like markets where you can buy and sell, but they're pretty boring because they basically the markets just move up randomly, completely randomly. There's no logic behind it. And in our case, it kind of works like this, that when you start the game, I mean, in the early game, there's a certain amount of supply in the market. Let's say, I don't know, 100K, 100,000 food on the market. And if you'd buy that amount of food, you'd basically cap the market price and you wouldn't be able to sell it for higher. And you can also crash the price with relatively small amounts of buying or selling a resource. And then as the time goes on, the market caps becomes bigger and you have to buy or sell more to move the market. And because we have a dynamic system of supply and demand like this, we can actually tie some in-game events to affect how the market changes. For example, we have like one event where uh, it's randomly gonna select a resource that's gonna change in price. For example, let's say that the food business is suddenly growing like huge, which is gonna put more supply in the market, and that's gonna slowly reduce the price of the food. And the player can then basically take advantage of that and start selling food early before the price crashes, if you see where I'm going with this. And similarly, we don't have this yet, but we want to add things like as you conquer territories, even through military, it would have an effect on changing the market prices as well. So you can basically, in a way, control or manipulate the market prices, and they're not just random. So the player actually has some agency on how things move.
That's incredible. And that's actually something I
Mhm.
really, really wanted to talk about because
Yeah.
I feel like when it comes to games like this that have some
Mhm.
sort of world map,
Yeah.
typically the way that the trading or the market is that you trade
Mhm.
with other villages or you trade with other countries, right? And I'm thinking of
Yeah,
like
like for example, civilization or
right, or
things like
like
that.
Total War where you're like I'm going to
Yeah.
trade with this warlord or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah.
So did you guys ever think about going down that route and being like, I can completely buy this settlement's wood out and maybe they'll come back to me and I can offer
Mhm.
to buy them out? I mean, was that an option for you
Mhm.
guys?
Actually, I honestly think it's not, and one of the reasons is because our game, unlike, for example, Civilization and those sort of games, our game is primarily an incremental game. and we want to sort of have like an abstract layer between how big your civilization is, how many buildings you're building. Like in your current recording of it, there you can have like 10 automated pump, but in the late game, as you play a long time, the players can actually get to building 10,000 of each building. So the world is a bit abstracted because that gives us the option to focus on management of the resources, and that also introduces neat opportunities to have mechanics like automation in the game. So basically, later in the game, you can also unlock automation, which will help distribute the workers to different buildings based on how you set it up. And we kind of wanted to convey that management feeling with the game, and not so much the micromanagement aspects that games like Civilization or those other sort of games usually have, where you constantly have to be on the map and move around and click this and that. So basically, we're trying to have the game a bit more casual and not require players' action for every little thing, which makes the game different. Maybe some players that prefer games like with a lot of player actions on the map, uh, they might find it interesting to basically go a bit back and focus more on the macro management of things and that a bit abstract concept of taking over the world.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, that makes sense. I feel like Civilization and
Yeah.
Total War can definitely
Hmm.
get bogged down in
Yeah.
people
Exactly.
moving, people conquering territories, trying to do
Exactly.
trade deals. So that makes perfect sense.
Exactly. It can get a lot quickly. Like, for example, in our game, there's actually, we divide the world into regions, and there's 450 regions, and each region has 20 territories, and each territory has 5 zones to conquer to basically own that territory. So like, if you can imagine, if the player would have to go like manually through all of those, it would get out of hand very quickly. So
Very
that's why we
quickly.
have that abstraction in place, because otherwise, like, we could make some mechanics really fun, but then it would quickly become too much for the player to manage. So that's one decision we made quite early on. It has some pluses and minuses, but if we're trying to convey a primarily like a managerial experience and one that can grow to huge numbers and give you that feeling of actually controlling like the whole world, like 5, 6, 7 billion people, we kind of had to go with this option. Um, so, and that's something we'll still build towards. And like we talked about earlier a bit about the economic point of view and gameplay, we actually want to introduce some new gameplay levels, like changes in meta. Like in the early game, you're just basically building buildings, managing the workers. But and at later stages, let's say when you get to conquer a continent or something like that, we'd really love to do like mechanics where you're basically just controlling the continents on a more macro level. Like this continent focuses on food, this one on wood, and things like that. So we want to bring the experience from um,
A very zoo.
micromanagement of,
Yeah.
yeah, from the micromanaging the buildings to basically managing continents and possibly even further from that. So the kind of gameplay evolves for time.
Wow. Okay. So I do have another technical question about your world market because I'm still,
Yes,
my mind is
it's
still
still there.
very much blown on the world market.
Cool,
Um,
awesome.
how on earth do you guys balance something so dynamic a as an economy in a game like this? I mean, I imagine that it just has to be
Yeah,
a complete and total nightmare, or maybe you guys are kind
exactly.
of at that point where you're like, you know what, the numbers are the numbers, and we're gonna focus on something else until we can come back to it. Like, how on earth Do you guys
Yeah,
balance that?
it's a bit of a nightmare. So that's for sure, because the moment you give players different ways to play, that's like the first thing that's gonna be really hard to balance, because and currently our game is best balance for military, as we didn't get so much time into the economic balancing yet. uh, and how we balance that, first we do how would I say it, like a broad logic between the connection between the resources. For example, let's say that on average, if a farm produces, I don't know, let's say 10 food per second, then the market prices, if you, let's say, produce wood and sell it for gold and then buy food with that, the market shouldn't go above that value. So we do some sort of sorry, what's the word, like broad level, a surface level balancing, where we kind of define the broader relationships between the resources and mechanics, and that gives us like a good basic balance. But from then onwards, it's just playtesting, tweaking things, getting save files from users. That's why we also had the game. We actually started with playtesting super early. I think we started the first playtests in like June 2020, and we had some base mechanic setup and base relationships between the resources, and then players played and we tweaked the mechanics after 2 weeks, after 1 month, and actually even some how resources and buildings work uh, are some things that we actually completely reworked a few times in the past 6 months, until we got to something that feels good and is actually easier to understand for the player as well. Because one of the things you can easily get to is making mechanics too complicated, and they might
Yeah.
work, but how the hell are you gonna convey that to the player and teach them? So that's why we also reworked the UI and everything, and it's much more sleek. It doesn't contain too much information for the player, and it also makes decisions much easier and helps player understand the mechanics between resources a bit better. But yeah, we still have, for example, for the market, we still have a lot of balancing to do there, because like I mentioned earlier, we'd really love to do something to have the game kind of transition from, oh, I think we actually didn't mention this yet, but the game is basically about post-apocalyptic world where nuclear war destroyed the civilizations, and then it's up to you to rebuild it and conquer it back and have humanity prosper again. So we kind of want to convey that experience of early in the game you are surviving, then you're expanding, working on resources, then you have to compete for the land, competing with other people, and the last stage we'd love to work on is like at the end the world is basically back together and you're back again in this economic capitalistic state, and you have to manage on more a broad level. So that's still something that, so we'd love to have economy be a bigger part of the super late game. So we're gonna balance around that more
Well, that's
going forward.
awesome.
Yeah.
Um, I just lost my train of thought. I had a couple of other questions, but I honestly
Mm-hmm.
forgot
It
what.
happens. No worries. It happens to all of us.
um, so we talked a little bit about the UI, and I have to say that I think the UI
Mm-hmm.
is really easy to make from a player perspective. It's really
Oh, cool.
easy. I thought it was a
That's
pretty
awesome to hear.
straightforward kind of UI. It wasn't overly
Uh-huh.
complicated. I picked it up pretty quick. How
Cool. That's good to hear.
Yeah, how many iterations did you guys go through? How many
Ah, okay.
times did you guys like playtest just for
Mm-hmm.
UI, like, because this game is,
Mm-hmm.
I would say, is
Yeah, it's
probably
UI heavy. Yeah.
very UI heavy. So, I mean,
Yeah.
was this probably your biggest challenge in the game? Was the UI and making sure that it was easy for
I think
anybody?
definitely it was, yeah, even a more big challenge than balancing, because one of the things is teaching the player the mechanics and having things be understandable and still make sense and still be fun, and that is really tough. Like we actually, I think we did like 3 or 4 major UI overhauls. We basically started with a super basic one. We prototyped it, and that was really pretty much just sort of spreadsheets. Like you have this resource here, assign citizens, build building, and that was fine for the prototype. But as we started adding more things and more mechanics, things had to start getting more clear and less congested, so to say, because the UI would suddenly become just a list of rows and buttons, and that from a management perspective can be fine, but then we also had to start thinking how to make the game look good and presentable, because if you just make it like a spreadsheet simulator, it's going to be really hard to uh, get a wider audience to play. So the first few iterations were mostly like that, and then we did probably a bigger iteration once per month. We also had like playtesters with us from the very early versions. We had some people really interested in it from the very first prototypes, and that was mostly incremental and idle players who usually can get around a bad UI or not much with visuals. So they really helped us a lot in figuring out the main issues the game had and what things we have to make more understandable and what mechanics weren't good. Because a lot of the mechanics, how currently buildings and jobs and citizens and research and everything works, that went under like 3 or 4 iterations as well. Because one of the things is that most buildings require a certain amount of resource to keep them going and to be able to produce things. For example, like a farm requires wood and water to be able to produce food, and some buildings require energy, and so on and so on. And early on, we had like most buildings, even like police stations, school, fire stations, embassies, require electricity, water, and sort of like logical things that you need to have going in real life to keep a building going. But then we ended up realizing that that started getting super complex for users to manage, and we actually ended up deciding that we removed costs from some buildings and basically just kept the operational costs on buildings that actually produce stuff. So that's like your farms, forests, and things like that. But buildings that provide jobs and are required to balance certain mechanics in the game. For example, doctors can keep your citizens healthy, policemen help prevent riots, firemen take out fires, and things like that. And so yeah, we had to simplify some of the game aspects, and we kind of iterated on that and iterated on that and slowly got to what the game is like now. And thankfully, a few months ago, I think it was in January, I think, yeah, basically at that point, we weren't working with a proper designer. Actually, our my colleague who is the marketer started working on the design, and we did the iterations, and he didn't have much previous experience, but we got a few good iterations done. But the game wasn't really very presentable to a wider audience. And luckily, some cool dude contacted us, and he said that he's a UI designer, and he actually helped prepare us the basics for the design that the game has now which is more modern, much more clean, and we were able to remove a lot of the busy areas in the game and basically just clean it up, because the old design was way more crowded with text, numbers, and it just didn't look pretty. So where we're at is much, much better, but there's always room for improvement. So we'll see how we'll go about that.
It looks good. He's done an
Cool.
excellent job.
Yes, we'll let him know. Yeah, we're super happy with it as well. And that kind of, he basically prepared a basic design and we adjusted some things from his design. So there's still some things to improve, but yeah, I think it should be quite presentable and also understandable for the players. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So we've seen a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
combat now.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wanted to talk maybe a little bit about the future plans of combat, if there
Yeah.
are any. Because right now I think
Mm-hmm.
it's tanks, and you as the
Mm-hmm.
player can help out with like an airstrike.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you guys thought about, uh, I don't know about, I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
say like changing, but adding some mechanics like maybe like foot soldiers and which will
Yeah.
cost like idle citizens and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. I mean, what are your plans for
Mm-hmm.
combat in the future?
Yeah, so actually, for combat, we did a major rework a few months ago because the game in the early stages, it didn't really have different tanks or any active skills. But the thing we kind of leaned on the most is that we actually don't want to add too much more variety or active skills to the combat. And this again comes down to the sort of general experience we want to convey with the game, which is more of a casual, idle slash incremental game that deals with huge
Sure.
numbers, and one that you can also play through quickly. And the problem with making combat more, let's say, active, or let's in general just call it more polished or require more user interaction or more strategy, the problem with that is that when you have 40, 50,000 battles for the users to do, that are those sort of things become repetitive really quickly. And also, I'm not sure if you tried it, but the combat also has some automation settings,
Yeah.
which basically allow you to, for the combat to, sorry, to just battle the enemies by itself. Like it sets formations, destroy the enemies, and you can also speed up time to sort of pass the time faster and not have to deal with the micromanagement constantly. So that's one of the main reasons why we actually think that if we developed combat a lot more and require more strategy and management from the player, it would actually make the game less enjoyable, because the focus of the game is not on like giving the best combat possible, because there's 100 games that can do that better than we can, and we are just trying to focus on the management aspect of it and on growing and on oh sorry, for some reason I'm coughing. um, so yeah, we're trying to focus and deliver the best possible management and sort of incremental experience, and making combat too complex would kind of take away from that, in our opinion. So
Sure. You run into the civilization problem where it's like, well, I've got
e-
cavemen, now I need spearmen, and
exactly,
now we're gonna do tanks, and
exactly,
okay, okay.
exactly. Um, yeah. Sorry, I just have to take a drink.
Yeah, go for it. Uh, so
Hmm.
I, I, it's kind of like you said. I think in the beginning of this interview, you talked a little bit about how maybe people were like, oh well, I don't see idle,
Hmm.
these idle games. Maybe they're
Hmm.
just not as fun or not as challenging, and then they spend a
Hmm.
couple of hours in the game. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, how how do you guys improve, like, maybe the sense of fun and maybe a sense of challenge? Like, I mean,
Uh-huh.
it's not necessarily all through like adding, maybe more events, like we've seen,
Mechanics.
yeah,
Exactly.
earthquakes, and we've seen fires and things like
Yeah.
that. um how do you balance the challenge of
and
management?
making the game more fun, like more
Yeah,
juicy, right?
yeah.
Yeah, so this is actually a problem we've had because from the very beginning, our goal was to make the game primarily suitable for incremental players and idle players, but also for other genre players. And that's because we originally were planning to release the game on the web platform Congregate, if you know it.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so that's what basically one of the biggest web platforms for idling incremental games. And our sort of business plan was to focus on that primarily because our previous game, Warclicks, was also on there and we had experience with that. But then during our development, like a few months in, Congregate stopped accepting new games. And we our plan was kind of ruined and we had to look towards Steam, which we were planning to do anyway, but we weren't gonna focus on making it a broader experience. But after Congregate stopped accepting games, we kind of had to make the decision to make the game a bit more approachable to a wider audience, like your
Sure.
4X players, strategy players, and things like that. And we had to make like some decisions, like do we make it an amazing incremental game, or do we go more towards a visual style and things like that? So we ended up taking like a middle route where we can still make it like a really great incremental, but also make it more approachable for the general public. But with how wide the game is, like the mechanics of idling incrementals and all that, it's a lot of things to polish and to improve the onboarding. And because we had to constantly like adjust things and test out mechanics, we didn't manage to polish and juice up the game much up until recently. Also, that's oh, sorry again. And that's primarily because like we constantly kept adding mechanics, expanding the game, and things like that. And especially until we had like a final UI that we were happy with, we couldn't actually polish like the onboarding, the animations, the tutorials, and all of that. So this is actually something that we're working on right now, and we're trying to add more animations, feel the game feel a bit more alive, because especially like in the screen of resources where there's basically just buildings and boxes and buttons and things to assign to, uh, there's in a way not much you can do like to make the game feel more alive. But then again, you sort of can, like by just making the animations and the buttons and have for example, we're gonna do some animations on the building icons, buttons. We're also gonna improve the sound effects a lot, and we're doing that update actually next week, and a lot of the things are gonna be much more improved already.
Uh,
So
that's awesome.
yeah, yeah, we finally got to that part. Like we we had to do so many things with like just the mechanics and everything that took a while, but we're finally getting to the juicy part, and a lot of the changes are feeling much better already.
Yeah. Hey, gameplay is important.
Yeah,
I don't,
for
I don't,
sure.
I don't know that anybody would disagree.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
uh, okay, so I think you've answered just about all of my technical questions. I want to ask you some fun
Sure.
questions.
Oh, awesome.
Has your family, friends, significant other, have they played the game, and what do they think about it?
Yeah, actually, in my own example, like my mom and dad, they can hardly use a computer. So the only game we actually managed to get my father to play was a chainsaw game where there's just a chainsaw that does noises because he's not into tech at all. My mom also not, but some friends, we do play test with them and see how they react. And most of them are not in incremental games, and which is actually cool because we get to see how they react to games and if our onboarding is clear, if they understand the game. So that's cool to see. But yeah, we still have to do more of that actually, because it teaches you a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Bringing in people who don't play games to play a game is probably some of the
Yeah,
best feedback you'll ever get when it comes to
exactly.
playtesting.
Exactly. People who roast you or get stuck, that's the best teachings you can get about your game's experience.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
So, you've talked a little bit about the different ways to beat the game, right? You said there's
Hmm.
primarily military and then economics.
Hmm.
What is your favorite way to beat your game? Is it military?
Military.
Build all the
Yeah,
tanks, take over all the
military.
things.
Exactly. Yeah, I primarily love automation. Like you just build up stuff and then you upgrade your tanks, build a ton of them, then set up automation for combat. They go through that. Oh, and yeah, I didn't mention, but one of the features we have is like time speed, time speed increase. Like the game runs at a certain time, but the player can increase it to 2, 4, even up to 10 times.
Oh wow,
And
okay.
that's basically, yeah, that's basically because we kind of, oh, that's actually one of the things that kind of helps us get rid of the balance issue, because if you can allow the player to play the game at sort of a super fast time, that can help them get through the boring parts, if you know what I mean. Like if
Sure,
they get
yeah.
stuck or they have to, let's say, grind for things, they can basically just speed up and that helps them build it up. So we actually, if we'll keep developing the game and add a lot of updates, we even have like crazy plans to add up to 100 speed in the game.
Oh wow.
And it basically, but that is gonna need a lot more content added to the late game, where you basically have to defend the world from natural disasters, asteroids, and things like that. I hope we get to that point. That would be pretty cool.
That
Yeah,
sounds like a
but
lot of
I really
fun.
like automation aspect of it. Like also there's a feature called colonies you mentioned, and that's basically you place different colonies on the world map and they can help you conquer the world faster, but they're generally more costly. And I really like automating stuff in such games, so that's probably my preferred way.
That's awesome. So everybody knows, I'm playing this game. The recording is playing at 2x, or I'm playing the game at 2x
Yeah.
in this recording.
Can you
Um,
actually speed it up, or can you or do you have just 2x unlocked because you can unlock faster speeds?
I think I unlock 3x later. I don't think I show it, but I
Uh,
do see. I was gonna say in the research tree, I did see that
mhm.
there was a 3x and a 4x. So
Yeah, yeah. Actually, with the coming update, we're gonna change the default max speed to 4x because exactly of that. So new players, like if the game is too slow for them, they can still play faster and yeah, and even then unlock faster speeds. So we kind of had they have this concept of play at your own pace. So that because that's like a trap that many idle games got into, where the game suddenly comes to a halt and it gets boring, you have to wait. Or most, for example, idle games also have like in-app purchases, so then you suddenly have to buy stuff in the game to skip over things, and that's something we really wanted to avoid, and we don't have any of that. And basically, why not give the player the best possible experience, because usually playing at super high speeds and progressing fast is one of the best experiences in such games. So why not just give that option to the players to use at any time?
uh, music to my ears. That
Yeah.
sounds amazing. I appreciate that you guys are putting experience over microtransactions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's also much more fun to make the game, because our other game, like Worklix, that one has microtransactions. Like we also balanced it nicely so you can go through without it. But it's again one of those things, like if you don't have microtransactions, you can basically balance the game for just one type of player, because as soon as you have like in-game premium currency, then you have to take into account players without that to have a great experience, but also players who play faster and buy stuff to also have a great experience, which is kind of, it doesn't go together that well. So
Right.
we just tried to avoid that altogether in this one.
That's amazing. I appreciate that as a gamer.
Yeah, I think many people do. Yeah, I don't like those sort of things as well. It just
Right.
gives a much better experience generally.
So I think my last question, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit.
Hmm.
What are your future plans for the game? You kind of talked about maybe protecting
Hmm.
the world from natural disasters. You're talking about adding in late game content.
Hmm.
What are
Yeah.
some of those features and some of those
Hmm.
expansions?
Yeah, so like we think that currently, I think the game currently like easily can keep you occupied for 20 to even 60 hours, even more if you're doing challenges and prestige and getting basically growing bigger numbers and things like that. So one of the things we want to add more of is different challenges and achievements. So and have different difficulties of the game. We actually added this in the recent update, but we like once you go through the game and play through it, we want to add like more new different events that make basically managing much harder, and you have to optimize better. Then add new challenges that require you to build without certain things and things like that. But yeah, the other big thing is just extending late game content. We want to add more like those meta shifts, like you go from scavenging, conquering, managing the world, then maybe you have to protect the world. And like the end game goal card for us would be if we could like you defend the world, you have to work with the world to protect it from asteroids, diseases, outbreaks, things like that. But then also maybe expand to the moon, to other planets, defend from alien attacks and things like that. I mean, you can get pretty crazy. That's one of the things that's really cool about incrementals, because they're less graphically intensive, and that gives you a lot of options to just expand the gameplay. So that would be awesome if we could get to add those things, but it takes a lot of work. And just generally, we also want to improve quality of life, add more automation options and things like that, because that means a lot in a management game that has a lot of things you have to manage and change, and it deals with big numbers. So just those sort of things are our main priorities.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I do have one more question because I just thought of it.
Mhm.
Another fun
Sure.
question. How crazy have you seen these numbers get? Like, what's the most outrageous? Like, maybe
Okay.
you've gained like 6 million meat a second or something like that. Like, what's the craziest numbers you've pushed your
Oh,
game to?
yeah, I think the craziest number, actually the biggest number I saw, but it was because of bad balancing, was 1 to the power of 308. So,
To
I
the
mean, 10 to the
power?
power of 3, yeah, to the power of 308. For example, a million is 10 to the power of 6,
Right.
and the game actually supports numbers up to 10 to the power of 308. That's
My
basically
gosh.
the biggest number that most computers and game engines support. But actually, that was because of a bug in the uh, market demand and supply, because some numbers were balanced and some player played it. The game has like in-game timer that starts at the year 2000, and the guy played it up to the year 4500 or something. And
Oh my gosh.
yeah, and the how the scaling works is each week or something like that in the game, the demand gets slowly bigger and bigger, and after a few thousand weeks the number just got out of control because it was exponential. So we changed that a bit. But yeah, like the realistic numbers, I think with playtesting was probably something like 10 to the power of 13, 14 so far, because we
Wow.
don't scale exponentially, but you once you conquer the world, you have like limited amount of build spots on which you can build, so that sort of limits the amount you can scale to. I mean, the
Okay.
player could always like prestige a ton of times, repeat the game, get bigger starting boosts, and bring that number much higher. But currently, that's sort of like the max normal number, so to say, you can experience.
Man, that guy must have been like that playtester must have come back and been like, "Hey,
Yeah,
I won." You're like, "What do you mean?" You're
exactly.
like, "No, no,
And
I
the
I
funny thing is, sorry, go ahead. So,
I was just gonna say he's probably just like, yeah, I just got infinite wood or whatever. He's like,
yeah,
that's crazy.
exactly. Like when he sent me that, I was like, how the hell did this happen? And then he told me, yeah, I just kept my game open for 60 days running at times 10 speed. Okay, so that's how long it takes you to break it,
That's
which
crazy.
is
60
absurd.
days, 10 times speed. Okay,
Yeah,
I'll remember that. I'll remember that.
cool.
Well, Slosumo, you've been amazing. You've answered
So have
absolutely
you?
all of
Thanks.
my questions. Do you want
Awesome.
to thank anybody before we sign off here?
Yeah, sure. First off, you. Then, if anyone from our players is watching, thanks for playtesting, and thanks to anyone watching. Hope we shared some interesting information that can help you with your game.
Awesome. So again,
Cool.
guys, this has been Simpocalypse. It's on Steam. I think right. It's early access, or it's labeled as
Yeah,
early access right now.
exactly.
Um,
But we're launching 11th of May, so
ooh,
we
okay.
about 10 days. Yeah.
Oh wow, okay. And you're doing an interview 10 days beforehand? You're a
Yeah.
madman.
Yeah, I know. We are. But we'll manage.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time,
Thank
Slosville.
you
This
as
has
well,
been
man. It was
awesome.
great. Awesome. Cool. Thanks.